Sir, temperature spike. 142 rising.
August 12, 2000, 11:25 a.m. Barents Sea, 160 miles from Norway, 50 miles from the Kola Peninsula. Compartment 1, forward torpedo room, K-141 Kursk. Captain-Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, 27 years old, head of the turbine unit in the 7th Department, stood in the control center of Compartment 2 and watched through the open bulkhead hatch as the torpedo crew prepared for launch. He'd served aboard submarines for 6 years, completed dozens of exercises, and survived the brutal financial cutbacks that had left most of Russia's northern fleet rotting at anchor in Zapadnaya Litsa naval base. The Kursk was different, newer, better, one of the few submarines that still went to sea. Ready in 5 minutes, Senior Lieutenant Andrei Korovyakov called from the torpedo room. Fat girl is loaded and sealed. What Dmitry Kolesnikov didn't know, what none of the 118 men aboard the Kursk knew, was that within 4 minutes, 95 of them would be dead.
Say your prayers.
I'm not a religious man.
Victims not of enemy action, but of a catastrophic combination of cost-cutting measures, inadequate training, and unstable hydrogen peroxide fuel, a single faulty weld in a decade-old practice torpedo that would leak high-test peroxide onto bronze-lined launch tubes, triggering a chemical explosion that would detonate 7 live warheads and collapse the first 3 compartments of a submarine the Russian Navy considered unsinkable. The irony was crushing. The Kursk was the pinnacle of Soviet submarine technology, completed in 1993, as one of the first major naval vessels finished after the Soviet Union's collapse. Built at the Severodvinsk shipyard near Arkhangelsk, the Oscar Tucum-class submarine measured 154 meters bow to stern, with a double hull of stainless steel, 8.5 mm outer hull, high in nickel and chromium for corrosion resistance, and weak magnetic signature, separated by a 200 mm gap from the 50.8 mm thick inner pressure hull. The design could withstand depths of 600 meters and remain submerged for 120 days. The sail superstructure was reinforced to break through Arctic ice. The Kursk was armed with 24 Granite cruise missiles and 8 torpedo tubes capable of launching either torpedoes or Stallion anti-ship missiles. The Granite missiles had a range of 340 miles, flew at supersonic speeds above 12,000 meters, and were designed to swarm enemy vessels in intelligent attack patterns. Each Type 65 torpedo, nicknamed Fat Girl for its formidable girth, carried a 450-kilogram warhead, powerful enough to sink an aircraft carrier. The submarine's mission was clear: defeat an entire U.S. carrier battle group, consisting of 1 aircraft carrier, 1 guided missile cruiser, 2 warships, and 2 frigates. But weapons systems require maintenance, training, and funding, all of which had evaporated throughout the 1990s as Russia's economy collapsed. By 2000, the Northern Fleet had suffered such severe financial cutbacks that sailors sometimes went unpaid for months. Only the most essential frontline equipment was maintained. Search and rescue vessels, ironically, were not considered essential. In 1998, facing budget constraints and sitting on a stockpile of HTP torpedoes manufactured in 1990, the Navy decided to refit the Kursk to carry high-test peroxide torpedoes. HTP, concentrated hydrogen peroxide combined with kerosene, was cheaper to produce than other torpedo fuels. 10 torpedoes were available from the 1990 batch, 6 were rejected due to faulty welds. But since the torpedoes were intended to carry only dummy warheads for training exercises, the weld inspections weren't extensive. Some Navy experts opposed the decision. Other navies, including Britain and the United States, had discontinued HTP torpedoes precisely because hydrogen peroxide was not as stable as alternative fuels. The British Royal Navy had suffered several catastrophic HTP explosions in the 1950s, including the loss of HMS Sidon in 1955 when an HTP torpedo exploded in harbor, killing 13 men. The Americans had abandoned HTP research after multiple accidents. The Russian Navy proceeded anyway. Cost savings outweighed safety concerns. On August 11, 2000, the Russian Navy prepared for summer exercise, the first large-scale naval exercise in more than a decade, the first since the fall of the Soviet Union. 30 ships and 3 submarines were participating. At Vidyevo Naval Base, preparations were hurried. The 4 HTP torpedoes were brought out of storage to be loaded onto the Kursk. During the loading process, 1 torpedo was dropped. There didn't appear to be any damage, although some HTP was present around the seal. The loading crew reported the incident, and the presence of hydrogen peroxide, then continued loading the Kursk with dummy warheads and provisions. The torpedo was more than a decade old. Some components had exceeded their designed lifespan. Nobody conducted an extensive inspection. Nobody realized the seal was compromised. Now on the morning of August 12, the Kursk was submerged at periscope depth, 20 meters below the surface, monitoring the exercise area through its periscope. At 8:51 a.m., the Kursk requested permission to conduct a torpedo training launch. Permission was granted. The submarine dove to launch depth. The launch crew passed through the control center in compartment 2 and entered compartment 1 at the bow. They closed the watertight bulkhead hatch behind them and sealed it. Standard procedure. Between the first and second compartments ran an air duct that extended through all 9 watertight compartments in the submarine. Best practice dictated sealing the duct like the bulkhead hatch, but the sailors left it open. When a torpedo launched, it created a high-pressure wave inside the compartment. Leaving the duct hatch open helped dampen the pressure wave. It had been almost 3 years since the crew had fired a torpedo. None of them had received training on handling and launching an HTP torpedo. They took out the operations manual to reference procedures they didn't remember. The crew should have inspected the torpedoes before loading them into the launch tubes, but this was a major exercise, the biggest in a decade, and there was enormous pressure to perform, to demonstrate that the Russian Navy still functioned, that the fleet wasn't completely broken by economic collapse. There was a lot to prepare. They took the Type 65 torpedo out of storage, wheeled it to launch tube number 4 on the starboard side, and slid it into position. The torpedo launch tube was designed to direct blast force outward toward the sea rather than into the submarine. The torpedo loading door was 3 times stronger than the external door. It was a safety feature engineered precisely to protect the crew in case of malfunction. But that safety feature only worked if the door was closed. At 11:25 a.m., more than 2.5 hours after beginning preparations, the torpedo crew finally initiated the launch sequence. They would fire this practice torpedo toward the Kirov-class battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky as part of the exercise. Fat Girl weighed 5 tons without its warhead attached and measured 10.7 meters long. Once loaded into the tube, electrical connectors on the inner door had to make contact with connections on the back of the torpedo to complete the firing circuit. The system didn't show a positive connection. The crew reopened the door to clean the connectors, both the torpedo contacts and the tube contacts, which were possibly corroded after 3 years without use. What they couldn't see, what the inadequate pre-launch inspection had failed to detect, was the small leak of hydrogen peroxide seeping from the faulty weld where the torpedo had been dropped during loading. Hydrogen peroxide is normally stable when properly sealed. But when it comes into contact with a catalyst, it undergoes explosive decomposition, expanding 5,000 times in volume while generating enormous heat. That's precisely what HTP is designed to do in a torpedo, provide both oxygen and heat to burn kerosene fuel underwater where atmospheric oxygen isn't available. Bronze and brass are catalysts for hydrogen peroxide. The torpedo launch tubes in the Kursk were lined with bronze. At 11:28 a.m., the small leak of HTP from the compromised seal came into contact with the bronze lining of the torpedo tube. The 1 ton of hydrogen peroxide inside Fat Girl began reacting. The chemical reaction generated temperatures approaching 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The kerosene fuel tank failed. Half a ton of kerosene ignited alongside rapidly expanding hydrogen peroxide in an explosion that consumed all available oxygen in the torpedo room within seconds. With the launch tube door open for connector inspection, the explosion was directed into the submarine instead of out to sea. The 7 crew members in the torpedo room died instantly. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Korovyakov, Seaman Pavel Safonov, Torpedoman 3rd Class Sergei Lubushkin, Torpedoman 2nd Class Roman Martinov, Torpedoman 1st Class Mamad Jafarov, Senior Torpedoman Arnold Borisov, Captain 3rd Rank Alexei Mitayev, the Torpedo Division Commander. The enormous blast wave, along with smoke and superheated fire, pushed through the open air duct into compartments 2, 3, 4, and 5. The partially open torpedo door was blown off its hinges. The command center in compartment 2, where Captain-Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov had been standing moments before, was engulfed in flames. Despite being at periscope depth with the periscope raised, there was no time for anyone to react, no time to surface, no time to activate emergency systems. The open air duct meant the explosion wasn't compartmentalized. All 36 crew members in control of the Kursk were killed within seconds. Captain 1st Rank Gennady Lyachin, the commanding officer, 45 years old. Captain 2nd Rank Vladimir Bagrants. Captain 3rd Rank Sergei Dudko, the executive officer. Captain 3rd Rank Viktor Belagun. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Murashev, Lieutenant Maxim Safanov, Lieutenant Alexander Sadkov, Lieutenant Rashid Ariev, Senior Warrant Officer Nail Kafizov, and dozens more, navigators, engineers, communications officers, sonar operators, dead in an instant. At 11:29 and 34 seconds, Norwegian seismic detectors picked up a notable event. The NORSAR array, designed to detect nuclear weapons tests, registered seismic activity measuring 1.5 on the Richter scale. The location was pinpointed at 69°38 north, 37°19 east, northeast of Murmansk, approximately 160 miles from Norway, and 50 miles from the Kola Peninsula. These were the last known coordinates of the Kursk. The fire from the first explosion spread rapidly through the forward compartments, reaching the torpedo magazine where 18 additional torpedoes were stored. 7 carried live warheads, each weighing 450 kilograms of high explosive. 2 minutes and 14 seconds after the initial explosion, at 11 hours 31 minutes and 48 seconds a.m., the warheads detonated. The second explosion registered 4.2 on the Richter scale, 250 times larger than the first detection, equivalent to nearly 3 tons of TNT detonating simultaneously. Seismographs across northern Europe recorded the event. Stations in Alaska detected it. Ships participating in summer exercise felt the shockwave and assumed it was part of the training exercise. The second explosion completely obliterated the first 3 compartments. The bow section, nearly 18 meters of the submarine, was shredded, crushed, and blown apart. A massive hole was torn in the pressure hull, allowing seawater to flood compartment 4. The explosion ripped through steel bulkheads designed to withstand depths of 600 meters. Sailors in compartments 3, 4, and 5 were killed instantly by the blast. 2 engineers in the nuclear reactor compartment, compartment 5, were thrown violently across the space by 50 g acceleration forces equivalent to a high-speed car crash. Their bones shattered, bodies twisted. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Panyushkin, Warrant Officer Yuri Nusanov, the Kursk, mortally wounded, began its final dive. The nuclear reactors in compartment 5 were protected by the strongest bulkheads on the submarine, reinforced steel capable of withstanding the same pressure as the external hull, plus 13 centimeters of additional steel casing. The reactors themselves were mounted on shock-resistant foundations designed to withstand 50 g impacts. Miraculously, both reactors survived. As the submarine's electrical systems failed and compartments flooded, the reactors executed automatic shutdown procedures, inserting control rods and halting the nuclear reaction. A Chernobyl-style disaster was averted. The Barents Sea would not become a radioactive dead zone. But that was small consolation to the men still alive in the rear compartments. 24 men were assigned to compartments 6 through 9 toward the stern of the submarine. 23 survived the initial explosions. Warrant Officer Dmitry Starostin in compartment 6. Captain-Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov in compartment 7. Senior Lieutenant Rashid Ariev in compartment 6. Seaman Alexander Brashkin. Seaman Sergei Kovalev. 23 men, injured, terrified, trapped in darkness as their submarine settled onto the seabed 108 meters below the surface. When submarines are underwater, all hatches are closed to segment watertight compartments. Following the explosions, survivors in the rear compartments immediately sealed air duct hatches and assessed their situation. The assessment was grim. Normally, during an emergency, sailors in rear compartments would move forward to compartment 3, where they could enter an escape capsule in the conning tower. If that route was blocked, there was an escape trunk in compartment 1. But the first explosion had destroyed compartment 1. The second explosion had flooded compartment 3. The escape routes were gone. The 23 survivors gathered in compartment 9, the smallest compartment on the submarine, measuring roughly 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. It contained the steering motors for the submarine's rudders and dive planes. It also had an escape hatch. Emergency lighting was normally powered by batteries located in compartment 1, which had been destroyed. Fortunately, compartment 9 had its own independent emergency lighting system. Dim red lights illuminated the space, casting long shadows across machinery and control panels. The men took stock of their situation. Several were injured, broken bones, burns, lacerations from flying debris. The compartment's watertight bulkhead was damaged, twisted by the force of the explosions. Water was seeping through the seal at a slow but steady rate. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Without power, the submarine's heating system was offline. The water temperature in the Barents Sea was 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. They had emergency rebreathers, individual survival devices containing potassium superoxide cartridges. As the men exhaled, carbon dioxide and water vapor in their breath triggered a chemical reaction with the potassium superoxide, which absorbed CO2 and released oxygen. Each cartridge lasted approximately 1 hour before the chemical was exhausted and had to be replaced. They had limited cartridge supplies. Captain-Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov was one of 3 surviving officers. At 27 years old, he was newly married to his wife Olga, whom he'd wed just 6 months earlier. He was an experienced officer, trained in damage control procedures, familiar with submarine emergency protocols. He understood exactly how dire their situation was. At 1:15 p.m., 1 hour and 45 minutes after the second explosion, Kolesnikov took out a pen and a piece of paper. He wrote 2 notes. On one side, a private message to his family. On the reverse, he outlined the situation. All personnel from sections 6, 7 and 8 have moved to section 9. We feel bad, we are breathing carbon dioxide. Pressure is increasing in the compartment. If we head for the surface, we might not survive the compression. We won't last more than a day. We've made the decision because none of us can escape. 23 people are here. Lieutenant Rashid Ariev, trapped in compartment 9 with the others, also wrote a note on a page torn from a detective novel he'd been reading. He explained that the explosion was caused by faults in the torpedo compartment, namely the explosion of a torpedo the Kursk had been testing. He described how the submarine was tossed violently, how equipment tore loose and injured crew members. He wrapped the note in plastic and put it in his pocket. The survivors faced an impossible decision. Compartment 9 had an emergency escape hatch that opened to the outside. They had emergency rebreather hoods that would provide enough air to swim 108 meters to the surface, theoretically. But the explosion had twisted the submarine's hull. The escape hatch might be damaged, might not open properly. Even if it did open, the outer airlock might already be flooded, which would mean opening the inner hatch would immediately flood compartment 9, drowning everyone before they could escape. And even if they successfully opened the hatch and swam out, the water in the Barents Sea was freezing. Survival time in 5-degree water without protective suits, approximately 30 minutes before hypothermia caused unconsciousness, perhaps an hour before death. Finding swimmers in the open ocean was nearly impossible under ideal conditions. In the middle of a military exercise with dozens of ships and submarines maneuvering in the area, with storms rolling across the Barents Sea, the chances of rescue were infinitesimal. And then there was the pressure problem. Right now, the air pressure inside compartment 9 was still relatively close to surface pressure. But the compartment was slowly flooding. As water entered, it compressed the air pocket, increasing pressure. The human body absorbs nitrogen from compressed air. The longer they waited, the more nitrogen saturated their tissues. If they surfaced too quickly after prolonged exposure to high pressure, they would suffer decompression sickness, the bends, nitrogen bubbles forming in their blood and tissues, causing excruciating pain, paralysis, death. They could open the hatch now and take their chances in the freezing ocean with minimal risk of decompression sickness. Or they could wait for rescue, hoping the Northern Fleet would locate them before the compartment flooded completely or carbon dioxide poisoning killed them, but knowing that every hour they waited increased the pressure, increased nitrogen saturation, decreased their chances of successful escape, even if rescue didn't arrive. It was an impossible choice. Swim now, and almost certainly die of hypothermia while floating in the Barents Sea, forcing injured comrades to fight for one final hour of life. Or wait for rescue that might never come while the compartment slowly filled with water and carbon dioxide. The survivors decided to wait. Meanwhile, on the surface, confusion reigned. The Kursk was expected to resurface and make radio contact at 1:30 p.m. When that time passed without communication, nobody was immediately concerned. Radio equipment failures were relatively common, especially on older Soviet-era submarines. The Northern Fleet had learned to expect communication problems. At 5:00 p.m., more than 5 hours after the explosions, an Ilyushin Il-38 maritime patrol aircraft was dispatched to search for the Kursk at its expected resurfacing location. The aircraft searched for 3 hours without locating the submarine. At 6 p.m., the Kursk missed another scheduled communication check. Fleet headquarters tried to establish radio contact. No response. At 6:30 p.m., 7 hours after the disaster, the Northern Fleet officially began search and rescue operations. Additional aircraft were dispatched. Ships participating in summer exercise were redirected to search for the missing submarine. At 10:30 p.m., an emergency was declared. The training exercise was abandoned. All available assets joined the search, more than 15 vessels and 3,000 sailors. At 12:30 a.m. on August 13th, 13 hours after the explosions, the Mikhail Rudnitsky, the Northern Fleet's primary rescue vessel, departed Vidyayevo Naval Base. The Rudnitsky was a 20-year-old converted lumber carrier, equipped with 2 Priz-class deep submergence rescue vehicles, the AS-32 and AS-34, plus a diving bell, underwater cameras and cranes for salvage operations. The vessel had significant limitations. It lacked stabilizers to maintain position in heavy weather, which meant rescue submersibles could only be deployed in calm seas. The Barents Sea in August was rarely calm. Rumors began circulating among the families of Kursk's crew members. Wives, mothers, fathers and children gathered at Vidyayevo Naval Base, demanding information. Navy officials tried to reassure them. Probably just a communication failure, probably routine technical difficulties. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the possibility that Russia's newest, most advanced submarine had been lost. Deep below the surface, the 23 survivors were running out of options. The rebreather cartridges were lasting about an hour each. They had perhaps a dozen spare cartridges among them, maybe 15 hours of breathable air if they used the cartridges efficiently and remained calm to minimize oxygen consumption. But remaining calm was impossible. The compartment was pitch black except for dim emergency lighting. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Water continued seeping through the damaged bulkhead, rising slowly but steadily. Every hour, the water level climbed higher. Every hour, the air pressure increased as the water compressed the remaining air pocket. At 4:50 a.m. on August 13th, sonar operators on the Pyotr Veliki detected 2 anomalies on the seabed that might be the missing submarine. The coordinates were transmitted to the Mikhail Rudnitsky. At 9 a.m., the Rudnitsky arrived on location and began setting anchor. During the anchoring process, crew members heard an acoustic sound, possibly an SOS signal from the submarine, but dismissed it as the anchor chain striking the anchor locker. A trivial mechanical noise. It might have been 23 men hammering desperately on the hull, signaling for rescue. At 11:30 a.m., the Rudnitsky began preparations to lower the AS-34 rescue submersible. The process was agonizingly slow. The submersible had to be carefully hoisted over the side, checked and rechecked, crew briefed on procedures. 6 hours passed before the AS-34 entered the water at 5:30 p.m. At 6:30 p.m., 31 hours after the explosions, the AS-34 collided with an object 100 meters below the surface while traveling at 2 knots. Through a viewport, the crew could see they'd struck the Kursk's propeller and stern stabilizer. The impact damaged the submersible, forcing it to resurface for repairs. Its sister submersible, the AS-32, was prepared for launch. It entered the water at 10:40 p.m. The crew was given incorrect coordinates by the Pyotr Veliki and failed to locate the submarine. They reported detecting an acoustic SOS signal, but command determined it was probably biological noise, whales or other marine life. At 1 a.m. on August 14, 38 hours after the disaster, the AS-32 returned to the surface without accomplishing anything. During the morning of August 14, the salvage tug Nikolai Cheka deployed deep water camera equipment and obtained the first visual confirmation of the wrecked submarine. The images showed catastrophic damage from bow to stern. The Kursk was listing at a 25-degree angle, down by the bow. The forward section had plowed into the clay seabed for approximately 22 meters at a depth of 108 meters. Significantly, the periscope was raised, proving the incident occurred while the submarine was at periscope depth, no more than 20 meters below the surface. At 5 a.m., the repaired AS-34 returned to the water. The crew located the Kursk at 6:50 a.m. and attempted to attach to the after-escape hatch in compartment 9, directly above where 23 men were trapped, dying slowly. The AS-34 failed to achieve a seal. The submarine's hull was twisted. The escape hatch collar was damaged. After multiple attempts, the submersible's batteries ran dangerously low, and it was forced to surface. Weather conditions deteriorated. Wind gusted to 52 knots. Sea state reached 2.4 meters. The rescue operation was suspended. Now, more than 2 days after the disaster, the Russian government finally made an official announcement. The media was told that the Kursk had experienced minor technical difficulties and descended to the ocean floor in a controlled manner. Officials claimed to have contacted the crew and were actively providing services, air and power to keep them alive. It was a complete fabrication. First Deputy Admiral Vladimir Kurodov gave a press conference explaining that the Kursk had collided with a NATO submarine, probably American or British, which had been secretly monitoring the Russian naval exercise. The collision, he claimed, damaged the Kursk's hull and forced it to the seabed. But the crew was fine. Rescue was imminent. This explanation, blaming NATO, blaming foreign powers for Russia's failures, was politically convenient. It deflected responsibility from the Northern Fleet's deteriorating equipment, inadequate training and budget problems. It was also complete fiction. On Tuesday, August 15, weather conditions at the wreck site deteriorated significantly. Visibility was limited, waves reached 3 meters, currents intensified. Rescuers launched a diving bell twice but failed to connect to the submarine. An ROV, remotely operated vehicle, was deployed to attach to the rescue hatch but also failed. At 8 p.m., while launching the AS-34 submersible, it struck a crane boom and sustained minor damage. After repairs, it successfully launched at 9:10 p.m. but again failed to achieve a seal with the escape hatch. A crane ship, the PK-7500, arrived with a Project 18270 Besta-class deep submergence rescue vehicle. The Besta was a more advanced rescue craft capable of operations at depths up to 800 meters and could evacuate up to 18 survivors per trip. But weather conditions prevented deployment. The captain decided to sail closer to shore, deploy the DSRV there, then tow it to the wreck site. Shortly after midnight on Wednesday, August 16, the AS-34 made 2 more attempts to attach to the escape hatch. Both failed. During recovery, the submersible was badly damaged. Parts from the AS-32 were cannibalized to make emergency repairs. The PK-7500 returned to the wreck site with its DSRV under tow and attempted another rescue. The capsule failed to connect to the escape hatch and was itself damaged when it slammed into the Kursk's hull in heavy seas. At noon on Thursday, August 17, almost 6 full days after the disaster, Fleet Commander Admiral Vyacheslav Popov held another press conference. He continued to insist that a NATO submarine had collided with the Kursk, that no explosion had occurred, that the submarine remained intact on the seafloor with a leak between the first and second compartments. He claimed rescuers had heard Morse code being tapped on the Kursk's hull. This was likely true, but not recent. The tapping would have been from the early hours after the disaster, when survivors were still conscious, still able to signal. By August 17, there was no tapping, because everyone in compartment 9 was already dead. The end had come approximately 36 hours after the explosions. Sometime in the early morning hours of August 14, Captain-Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, Lieutenant Rashid Ariev, and another sailor had been exchanging rebreather cartridges. The compartment was pitch black. Water had risen to waist level. The temperature was below freezing. The men were exhausted, hypothermic, slowly suffocating as carbon dioxide levels climbed despite the rebreathers. One of the men lost his balance and plunged into the icy, oily water while holding a potassium superoxide cartridge. Potassium superoxide is as reactive as the hydrogen peroxide that caused the initial torpedo explosion. In normal use, water vapor in exhaled breath creates a small, controlled reaction that absorbs CO2 and releases oxygen. But when a cartridge is suddenly submerged in water, the reaction is violent and instantaneous. The cartridge exploded in a flash fire, releasing tremendous heat and caustic chemicals. Dmitry Kolesnikov was closest to the blast. The acid burned through his abdomen, exposing internal organs. The flesh on his head and neck was stripped away. He died within seconds. The other men dove underwater to escape the flames and corrosive chemicals burning their skin. When they surfaced, gasping for air, they found that the flash fire had consumed all available oxygen in the compartment. In order for humans to survive, they need at least 19.5% oxygen in the air they breathe. The chemical reaction designed to give them life had instead consumed the last breathable air in compartment 9. The men suffocated in darkness, alone, 108 meters below the surface of the Barents Sea. At 3:15 p.m. on August 17, President Vladimir Putin finally accepted offers of assistance from both Norwegian and British governments. The offers had been extended days earlier. Putin had refused them, insisting Russia could handle the rescue without foreign help, a matter of national pride, a refusal to admit that Russia's once mighty navy was now so broken it couldn't even rescue its own sailors from a submarine lying in relatively shallow water. By the time Putin accepted help, everyone aboard the Kursk had been dead for at least 3 days. On August 18, multiple diving teams arrived, Russian Navy divers alongside 6 teams of Norwegian and British specialists. On August 19, a full week after the sinking, a Norwegian vessel arrived carrying a British LR-5 rescue submarine. On August 20, an ROV was launched to inspect the wreck. It discovered that the front section of the Kursk, nearly 18 meters, was completely destroyed, crushed beyond recognition. Despite accepting foreign aid, the Russian Navy imposed severe restrictions on the Norwegian divers. They were permitted to work only on the escape hatch in compartment 9, the same hatch the Russian submersibles had failed to access for a week. They were also instructed on operating the air control valve on the rescue trunk. In their briefing, Russian officials told them the valve opened counter-clockwise. If they tried to turn it clockwise, it would break and render the rescue trunk unusable. The Norwegians attempted to turn the valve counterclockwise. It wouldn't budge. After struggling for several minutes, they ignored the instructions and turned it clockwise. The valve opened easily. The instructions had been completely wrong. When the divers accessed the rescue trunk on August 21, 10 days after the disaster, it was full of water. Once they opened the inner hatch, a small pocket of air streamed out of compartment 9, carrying a foul smell of decomposition, burnt metal, and chemicals. The divers measured oxygen levels at 7%, far below the minimum needed to sustain human life. They lowered a camera into the compartment. In the dim beam of underwater lights, they saw bodies floating in the water, suspended at strange angles, skin pale and bloated. All 23 men were dead. Following this discovery, the Russian Navy could no longer maintain the fiction that survivors might still be aboard. On August 21, Mikhail Rudnitsky, Chief of Staff of the Northern Fleet, broke the news to the families. The Kursk was flooded and all hands were lost. Admiral Popov apologized to the families. "Forgive me," he said, "for not bringing back your boys." The reaction from the families was explosive. Mothers screamed, wives collapsed. At one memorial gathering, a woman tried to confront officials and was forcibly sedated by medical personnel, images that were broadcast on Russian television and became symbolic of the government's callousness. On August 23, 2000, Russia declared a national day of mourning. President Putin posthumously awarded the Hero of Russia title to Commander Gennady Layashin. All other crew members were awarded the Order of Courage, but medals didn't bring anyone back. They didn't answer questions about why the rescue took so long, why foreign help was refused for days, why a submarine considered unsinkable had sunk so catastrophically. The families demanded answers, they demanded accountability. They demanded that the Kursk be raised and the bodies recovered. In October 2000, the Russian government contracted two Dutch salvage companies, Smit International and Mamoate, to raise the wreck. It would be the largest salvage operation of its kind, estimated to cost $65 million. The operation faced enormous challenges. The Kursk lay 108 meters below the surface, partially buried in clay seabed. It weighed 24,000 tons. 17 of the 24 torpedoes remained unaccounted for, potentially still armed and dangerous. The two nuclear reactors posed radiation risks. The first concern was the bow section. Salvage teams decided to sever it from the main hull to minimize the risk of detonating unexploded torpedoes during the lift. They installed hydraulic suction anchors in the seabed on either side of the bow and ran a large tungsten carbide saw through the hull. For 10 days, the saw worked back and forth until it broke through. A smaller section of the sonar dome and a piece of torpedo tube were recovered separately and examined by investigators. Next, the salvage barge Giant 4 sailed into position. The 130-meter semi-submersible pontoon was designed to transport massive objects like oil rigs. For the Kursk operation, it was modified to hold a lifting sling underneath. A hole was cut in Giant 4's hull to accommodate the Kursk's sail. Custom saddles were fabricated to match the submarine's hull contours. 120 miles of lifting cables were installed, connected to 26 hydraulic strand jacks controlled by a computer program that automatically adjusted tension to compensate for wave motion and current. A diving platform named Mayo was deployed with saturation dive teams who remained in compression for the entire 4-week operation, working in shifts around the clock. Using high-pressure water jets, they cut holes into the Kursk's hull and welded lifting rings in place. Each ring was attached to multiple cables. On October 8, 2001, 14 months after the disaster, the strand jacks engaged. Slowly, incrementally, the cables lifted the Kursk off the seabed. The submarine rose from its grave, still containing the bodies of 115 men. The final destination was Roslyakovo shipyard in Murmansk. To enter the floating dry dock, Giant 4 had to be raised even higher. 2 additional pontoons were floated underneath and inflated to lift the entire assembly 20 meters, allowing the giant barge to enter the dock with the Kursk suspended below. Once inside, the pontoons were inflated further to raise Giant 4 enough to detach the Kursk and set it down on the dry dock floor. Giant 4 then sailed out, leaving the submarine behind. In September 2002, the severed bow section, still lying on the seabed, was destroyed with explosives along with any remaining torpedoes. This ensured the wreck site was clear of hazards and prevented foreign governments from potentially recovering sensitive Russian military technology from the torpedo guidance systems and warheads. Once the sailors' bodies were recovered and properly buried, investigators thoroughly examined the wreck. The hull was systematically cut apart, compartment by compartment, each section analyzed for clues about what had gone wrong. When investigators recovered the practice torpedo that had been loaded into tube number 4, they found catastrophic failure at the center near a critical weld. The weld had failed, allowing hydrogen peroxide to leak into contact with the bronze-lined launch tube. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the reaction between HTP and bronze had generated temperatures exceeding 4,800 degrees Fahrenheit in a confined space, more than hot enough to ignite kerosene fuel and detonate the torpedo's propulsion system. Further investigation revealed that the torpedo had been manufactured in 1990 and had exceeded its designed service life by several years. The welds had never been properly inspected after the torpedo was dropped during loading on August 11. The loading crew had reported the incident and the presence of HTP around the seal, but no officer had ordered a thorough inspection. In the rush to prepare for summer exercise, the first major naval exercise in over a decade, proper safety protocols had been abandoned. The investigation also revealed that the crew had received no training on HTP torpedoes. The last time they had fired any torpedo was 3 years earlier, in 1997. Budget cuts throughout the 1990s had eliminated most training exercises. When the torpedo crew took out the operations manual on August 12 to reference launch procedures, they were essentially learning on the job. The open-air duct between compartments 1 and 2, left open to dampen pressure waves during launch, had allowed the initial explosion to propagate through 5 compartments instead of being contained in the torpedo room. If that duct had been sealed according to best practices, the explosion would have been confined to compartment 1. The 7 men in the torpedo room still would have died, but the other 111 crew members might have survived, sealed safely in compartments 2 through 9 with time to surface or await rescue. Investigators found Dmitry Kolesnikov's notes in his pocket, wrapped in plastic still legible. They found Rashidariev's note torn from a detective novel, also preserved. These documents provided the only first-hand account of what the survivors experienced in those final hours: the darkness, the cold, the rising water, the desperate hope for rescue that never came. The autopsies revealed that most of the 23 men in compartment 9 had died from a combination of factors: hypothermia, carbon dioxide poisoning, and ultimately asphyxiation when the flash fire consumed the remaining oxygen. Dmitry Kolesnikov's injuries were consistent with severe chemical burns. Several other bodies showed similar burn patterns, confirming the potassium superoxide explosion that had ended their lives. The investigation concluded that the disaster was caused by a chain of failures: inadequate maintenance, insufficient training, cost-cutting measures that prioritized saving money over safety, and the decision to use inherently unstable HTP torpedoes despite their known dangers. Recognizing the hazard, the Russian Navy immediately ordered all HTP torpedoes removed from service. Every submarine in the fleet was inspected. Every HTP torpedo was destroyed. The fuel would never be used again by Russian submarines. But for the families of the 118 men who died aboard the Kursk, these reforms came too late. The disaster also exposed deeper problems within the Russian Navy. The week-long rescue attempt had been a catastrophic failure at every level. The emergency rescue buoy in compartment 7 had been disabled in 1999 to avoid detection during operations and never reactivated, meaning the Kursk had no way to signal its location after sinking. The Northern Fleet's rescue equipment was outdated and poorly maintained. The Mikhail Rudnitsky lacked stabilizers and couldn't operate in moderate seas. The rescue submersibles were old, unreliable, and operated by crews with minimal training. Most damning was the Russian government's refusal to accept foreign assistance for nearly 6 days after the disaster. Norwegian and British rescue teams had been standing by since August 13, equipped with modern rescue equipment and highly trained divers. If they had been allowed to respond immediately, they might have reached compartment 9 while survivors were still alive. Putin's delay in accepting help, driven by national pride and a refusal to admit Russia's military inadequacies, had killed 23 men who might otherwise have been saved. The public outcry was immense. Russians demanded accountability. They demanded resignations. They demanded that someone be held responsible for the deaths of 118 sailors. No one was ever prosecuted. No admirals were fired. No government officials resigned. Instead, the Kremlin focused on controlling the narrative. State media emphasized the bravery of the crew, the tragedy of the accident, and the government's efforts to recover the bodies. Independent journalists who investigated the disaster too aggressively faced harassment. Television stations that broadcast criticism of the government's response found themselves under investigation for tax violations. One of the most vocal critics was Nadezhda Tilik, mother of Lieutenant Sergei Tilik, who died in compartment 2. She became a prominent figure in the family members group, demanding answers and accountability. "They let our sons die," she told reporters. "They had a week to save them and they did nothing. They refused help from countries that could have rescued them because they were too proud to admit they couldn't do it themselves." The wives of the deceased sailors faced particular hardship. Many were young, in their 20s, married only a few years or even months. They were left widows with small children, living in decrepit military housing in remote bases like Vidyavor, surviving on meager pensions. Olga Kolesnikov, Dmitry's widow, became a spokesperson for the families. She described receiving her husband's final letter, reading his private words written in darkness as he waited to die, knowing he had been thinking of her in those final hours. The Russian government eventually paid compensation to the families, approximately $40,000 per deceased sailor, a substantial sum in Russia at that time but hardly adequate compensation for losing a husband, son or father. The investigation into the disaster took nearly 2 years. The final report, released in July 2002, confirmed that the explosion was caused by HTP leaking from a faulty torpedo and coming into contact with the bronze-lined launch tube. The report also noted numerous contributing factors: inadequate maintenance, insufficient training, outdated equipment and poor emergency response procedures. However, the report stopped short of assigning individual blame. It concluded that the disaster was the result of systematic failures rather than the fault of any specific person. This carefully worded conclusion meant that no one could be held criminally responsible. Critics argued that the report was a whitewash designed to protect senior naval officers and government officials from prosecution. They pointed out that someone had approved the use of HTP torpedoes despite known safety concerns, someone had failed to properly inspect the torpedo after it was dropped during loading, someone had failed to ensure the crew received adequate training, and someone had delayed accepting foreign rescue assistance for 6 days. But in Putin's Russia, accountability for government failures was increasingly rare. The Kursk disaster became another example of a tragedy where the victims and their families received sympathy but no justice. The international community drew its own conclusions. NATO navies analyzed the disaster extensively, using it as a case study in submarine safety. The U.S. Navy issued new directives emphasizing the importance of international cooperation in submarine rescue operations and pledged to immediately accept foreign assistance in any future emergency. Britain, Norway, and other nations with submarine fleets reviewed their own safety protocols and rescue capabilities. An international submarine rescue organization was eventually established, allowing navies to cooperate on rescue operations without political delays. Member nations agreed to immediately accept assistance in emergencies, prioritizing the lives of trapped sailors over national pride. Russia participated in these initiatives. Beginning in 2005, the Russian Navy started participating in NATO submarine rescue exercises, an unthinkable development during the Cold War. The exercises tested combined rescue operations involving Russian, American, British, and Norwegian vessels working together. In 2011, the Russian Navy doubled the number of deep-sea divers trained each year from 20 to 40, recognizing that specialized diving expertise was critical for submarine rescue operations. New rescue equipment was purchased. Old vessels like the Mikhail Rudnitsky were finally retired and replaced with modern ships equipped with dynamic positioning systems, advanced rescue submersibles, and state-of-the-art diving equipment. But these reforms, however necessary, could not undo the tragedy of August 2000. The Kursk was eventually cut up for scrap at Severodvinsk Bay on the northern Kola Peninsula. The 2 nuclear reactors were defueled and disposed of according to international protocols. The hull was sectioned and melted down. By 2004, virtually nothing remained of the submarine except photographs, debris preserved as evidence, and the memories of those who had served aboard her. A memorial was erected in Vidyayevo Naval Base, listing the names of all 118 men who died. Similar memorials were built in Murmansk and in Moscow. Every year on August 12, families gather to remember their lost loved ones, husbands, sons, fathers, brothers who went to sea on a routine training exercise and never came home. The Kursk disaster remains one of the worst submarine accidents in history, comparable to the loss of the USS Thresher in 1963, which killed 129 men, and the loss of the Soviet submarine K-219 in 1986, which killed 4. But unlike those disasters, the Kursk sinking was unique in that survivors lived for hours or even days after the initial catastrophe, trapped underwater waiting for a rescue that arrived too late. That fact that 23 men survived the explosions only to die slowly in darkness while rescue vessels fumbled ineffectively overhead makes the Kursk disaster particularly haunting. It raises agonizing questions about what might have been if the rescue had been faster, if foreign help had been accepted immediately, if equipment had been better maintained, if crews had been properly trained. Dmitry Kolesnikov's final notes became symbolic of the tragedy. His words, written by feel in pitch darkness expressing both hope and despair, captured the impossible situation the survivors faced. His private message to his wife Olga, never intended for public eyes, was a reminder that these weren't just sailors or statistics but individual human beings with families, hopes and futures that were stolen by negligence and incompetence. "We feel bad," he wrote. "We won't last more than a day. We've made the decision because none of us can escape." They had made the decision to wait for rescue because swimming to the surface through freezing water seemed like suicide. They had trusted that the Russian Navy, their navy, would reach them in time. That trust was misplaced. The navy that sent them to sea in an improperly maintained submarine armed with dangerously unstable torpedoes operated by inadequately trained crews failed them one final time by botching the rescue operation. The Kursk disaster fundamentally changed how submarine operating nations approach safety and rescue. The casual acceptance of risk that characterized Cold War submarine operations, the attitude that losses were an acceptable cost of maintaining naval power, became unthinkable after August 2000. Modern submarine design emphasizes escape systems, rescue compatibility, and international cooperation. Submarines now carry improved emergency locator beacons that deploy automatically in emergencies. Escape trunks are designed to be compatible with rescue submersibles from multiple nations. Submarine crews train extensively on emergency procedures, including scenarios where they must abandon ship and survive until rescue arrives. Naval powers maintain rescue assets on alert status, ready to deploy within hours of a submarine disaster anywhere in the world. These changes have undoubtedly saved lives. Since 2000, there have been several submarine emergencies where improved rescue capabilities and international cooperation prevented tragedies. In 2005, a Russian AS-28 mini-submarine became entangled in cables off the Kamchatka Peninsula with 7 crew members trapped underwater. British and American rescue teams responded immediately and all 7 men were saved. But for the families of the Kursk's crew, these successes are bittersweet. Their loved ones died because those systems weren't in place when they were needed most. The Kursk lies in pieces now, scattered across a scrapyard, reduced to raw metal. The men who sailed her are gone, buried in cemeteries across Russia. But the memory of what happened persists, a reminder of the cost of negligence, the danger of pride, and the human consequences when governments prioritize appearances over the lives of their citizens. On August 12, 2000 at 11:28 a.m. a faulty weld in an aging torpedo allowed a small amount of hydrogen peroxide to leak onto a bronze surface in the bow of a submarine considered unsinkable. Within seconds 118 men were doomed. Most died instantly. 23 survived just long enough to realize that no one was coming to save them. Their story is a tragedy of errors compounded by institutional failure, of brave men let down by broken systems, of families denied justice, of a disaster that was entirely preventable if anyone in authority had cared enough to prevent it. The Barents Sea keeps its secrets. The clay seabed where the Kursk settled for 14 months shows no trace of the submarine now. Fish swim where men once died. The ocean is indifferent to human tragedy, but we cannot afford indifference. The Kursk disaster teaches us that safety requires vigilance, that maintenance matters, that training saves lives, that pride kills, and that when things go wrong, minutes matter. 118 men learned those lessons too late. We owe it to their memory to ensure no one else has to learn them the same way.